looking at the whole idea with this experiment was to see if we could, how long the shelf life of the produce would last if it was grown using the plasma. This is a picture of our micro radish that we supply to our customers. It's just the daikon radish, and it's about 7 days worth of growth, and when those first 2 leaves come out, then we just cut it and punitize it, so that restaurants and people use it as garnish on their meals, and it's a very nutritious to eat on its own as well, packed full of vitamins and minerals. So what we did with our radish to get that, we soaked 1 batch of our radish seeds in plain water, and then we soaked another batch of the seeds in a CO2 and CH3 plasma water. So this was just the water only, no GANS in it. And we soaked the seeds for 24 hours. Both of them were seeded in plain cocoa fiber after that and left to germinate. Then during the next 7 days, each batch was watered respectively with just the plain water and the other one with the plasma water. Both batches were harvested on the same day and packaged, and what we had previously found the previous couple of years was that we only got around 11, 14, 15 days of shelf life on our radish. Here's a picture of soaking the seeds. So the one on the left was just soaking in water, and the one on the right with the plasma water. So this is how we just left the seeds for 24 hours soaking in the water. We then planted them into the cocoa fiber in those punnets. And just to reiterate, the cocoa fiber is just a holding mechanism medium. There's no nutrition whatsoever in the cocoa fiber which would affect either one. The seeds are covered with cocoa fiber and vermiculite, and then they were watered respectively. So those that were soaked in CO2, we had watered again with some of the GANS water of the CO2 and CH3, and the other seeds we just watered with plain water. Here you can see the pictures of them starting to germinate. The one on the left with the plasma radish and the one on the right with the plain water radish. So you can see they both, there's no difference between the two at this stage. And again, we've got, once they're germinated, and we just take the cocoa fiber off the top there, and then when they're exposed to the light, they'll start turning green. The water only and the plasma water, the comparison there, also no real changes. And here's just before we started to harvest, the one on the left being plasma and the one on the right being just the water, plain water treatment. What we had noticed, up until this point, they both looked exactly the same, but when we did harvest them, what we did notice was there's certainly a difference in the root structures between the two of them. The top row there was the root structures of the radish just in the water, and the bottom row is those that have been soaked in the plasma. So you can see that there's a more rigorous root growth. It's whiter compared to the other one. So there, that was our own the main difference that we had noticed at this point in time, was just the enormous root growth compared to the plain water. So we cut the radish, washed and placed into the containers, and then these two containers were placed in our fridge, and we started the countdown. So that was day 1. On day 9, what I've done is the photo on the left is always day 1, and then I'm comparing it to the current photograph. So that would be day 9. at this stage, no change whatsoever. Is day 14. Now, normally, when we start getting to day 14, previously our radish would start certainly going yellow. You would get a smell from it, and generally you wouldn't be able to eat it by that stage. There's a very short shelf life. But after 14 days, it was still looking very, very strong. One could easily eat that radish with no problems. On day 20, also virtually no change from day 14. Still looking very good, no signs of any yellowing or rotting at all. On day 28, we have the same, still very green and no change in the state of the radish. Day 41, we had started seeing, you could see some of the radish had sort of a bit of discoloration there, going yellow, but otherwise the rest of it was still looking good. And when you felt the radish, it was still very, very firm, and it hadn't gone soft or soggy at all. There was another photograph that we took on day 47. And then we went to day 78, because then I'd forgotten about them. And when I looked at them, you could see that they had started going yellow, a bit more yellowing on the plants there. At this stage, you probably wouldn't want to eat them, but even though there was no smell coming off the radish and no sign of any rotting of the radish at all, but just that bit of discoloration of the yellowing. Then we went all the way out to day 134, and here you can see that completely gone yellow, bits of green there, but still no rotting happening. There was still no smell coming off the radish whatsoever. There's just a side view of those punnets, so you can see none of it had sunk down to the bottom, because generally that's what happens, is it all sinks to the bottom and turns into a liquid and just rots. But this is still quite firm and sort of spongy, taking up all the space in the container. And then we went all the way out to 180 days, and yes, now we're starting to see some degradation there and a bit of rotting of the micro radish. But even when we opened it at this stage, there was just no smell of rotting. It was a vegetation smell, and none of the real rotting smell that one would get from the radish. And you can see also at this stage the radish grown in the plasma is almost identical, a little bit better than the one grown in the water. All right, so there's a side view of the radish, and now you can see how it sort of settles to the bottom, and it will just eventually rot and form a nice black puddle in the bottom of the container. At this stage, we thought the experiment was over, and so we gave these to our chickens. Right, so when we look at the observations that we made from this experiment, is that since we started growing the radish, we've been doing it for about 3 years, none of our stuff had lasted beyond 15 days, even in our fridge and in retail shops. We always had a very short shelf life for this product. And during this time, by the time we got to 15 days, the rot would set in, and then you would have a smell that would fill the room because of the sulfur coming off from the radish. Only after the sort of the 41-day mark could we smell a slight odor from the water radish, but not the plasma radish. And they say that odor was more the vegetation odor. It was not the sort of sulfur smell that one would generally get from the radish. And we saw a bit of yellowing of some of the leaves in both containers. The interesting point here as well is the weight of the radish on day 1 was 47 grams. And even after day 41, it was still 44 grams. So it only lost 3 grams of moisture during that entire period, which is also quite astounding. And both were kept in the fridge at 4 degrees. Now, the big question is, why did the radish grown with the water only last just as long as the radish grown with the plasma water? Because we were a bit stumped at first, because we thought that the plasma radish should have been far better than the radish just planted with the water. So that was a big question that we had to answer. So essentially, because the water-only radish and the plasma water radish had been sitting next to each other from the seeding stage, as you could see when we sowed the seeds, they were next to each other. When we seeded them, they were next to each other. During the whole growth stage, they were next to each other. And then even in the fridge for the 180 days, they were either sitting next to each other or on top of each other. So the plasma radish, the radish that we soaked in the plasma had been interacting with the water-only radish. So the stronger fields were interacting with the weaker fields, thus causing the water-only radish to last just as long as the plasma radish. So essentially what is happening is, because they are both composed of the same material, they're both radish shoots, the one grown in plasma, being of the stronger fields, was interacting with the weaker one, which was the plain water one, and this was feeding and making sure that the water one stayed just as fresh as the plasma radish. And so you have that interaction from between the two, so the higher strength feeding the lower strength, and the connection is because they are of the same material. And then we had the next question was, why did it last so long in the fridge? 180 days was a very long time for any produce to be sitting in the fridge. And then we have to go back to our CO2 story as to why, when we use the CO2, why it works. And so we go back to, it's the connection between the amino acid structure of your seed and your plant, which is your carbons, oxygens, hydrogens, and nitrogens. So when you look at your CO2 GANS, it's your carbon and oxygen is the connection between your CO2 and your plants, whether it's the seeds or the plant matter. So essentially, by soaking the seeds in the CO2 water, we have created a maggraph field strength around the seed and the plant. So we've changed the whole environment around the plants. So it's not just a case of feeding the seed and, oh, well, it's going to change the seed. What it's done is it's created a whole new environment around that seed and plant. And when we look at food as to why food decays in our environment, food decays because it is essentially losing its field strength to the environment. So this decay process is exactly the same as when a neutron decays into a proton and electron. The environment is the weaker field and the plant is the higher strength. So what's happening here is your field strength of your plants, especially the freshly grown plants, of a stronger field, and they are giving into the environment which is of your weaker fields. So that is why food rots if left open or doesn't last very long in a fridge. And the shelf life of your food always comes back down to how strong or healthy your original plant was when it was grown. So essentially, the CO2 environment is created a whole new field strength around the plant. And we know that the CO2 has a MAGRA field strength of 44, and your amino acids of your plants has a field strength of 43. So your CO2, it created an environment that was protecting the plants from your normal outside environment. And this is why it lasted so much longer than before. So some of the implications is, can we place CO2, zinc, and amino acids, plasma water in our fridges at home to extend the life of the fresh produce we buy from the stores? It's an interesting point there. And can we place the same plasma waters in store shelves to extend the life of produce in the store? You know, my feeling is that it's best to start right at the source, so grow the food with the CO2, having the full nutrients in the plant, and then you can extend the shelf life of those plants much longer. But this is all sort of open for people to test as well, is to try and place some plasma devices in their fridges and just to see whether their produce, fresh produce, lasts longer than before.